Let's talk about this and a lot more with Republican presidential candidate Christie, who joins us at the table. So nice to have you in person. Good morning.
Good to be here. Thanks, guys.
Did Mitt Romney surprise you?
No, I kind of thought two things about Mitt. One, that I think he feels like he had done what he could do inside that institution. And secondly, I do think he's a guy who understands his place in the party at the moment, and that he doesn't want to stay there till he's in his 80s. Guy's got a big family, and that he's genuinely close to. Not like some politicians pretend to be close to their families. Yeah. He actually is. So I don't think he wants to be, commuting to Washington when he's 80.
It sounded like a lot more than that, to be fair. I mean, it sounded like a lack of hope that he could make a lot of change in 7.5 more years in the Senate. And I asked that because in many respects, and he talked about this to the Washington Post, like, you are representative of a lot of what he represents, and he feels hopeless, yet you are still charging full steam ahead to try to
I don't think he's hopeless, though, Poppy. I think what he is realistic about what you can do as one of 100.
Okay, let's call it realistic. Is he being more realistic than you are being?
No, because he's being realistic about what you can do as one of 100. I'm being realistic about what you can do as one of one. And if you're the president of the United States...
You can't do a lot without some of those 100.
Well, but you have the ability to persuade. And when you're president, you have a lot of advantages to persuade. Okay. And plus, I'm an incredibly persuasive guy. So, we'll be able to do a lot. And I think Mitt... I think his call for a new generation of leaders, when you have two guys as frontrunners who are going to be a combined 160 years old, probably makes sense just on the numbers. These guys, both of them, if they got elected, would be beyond the tables of life expectancy in their term as president. I think that probably makes no sense for us as a country.
Would you want his endorsement?
I'll take anybody's endorsement, honestly, in our Republican Party. If somebody wants to endorse me and come on and help, I'd be happy to have people's help. But in the end, what I learned, Phil, from 2016 was that endorsements don't matter nearly as much as they used to.
Yeah.
And in the end, what you want more than anything else is people who are helping you do the tough work of a presidential campaign on fundraising, on policy, and those kind of things. And look, Mitt Romney is one of the brightest minds in our party, one of the most experienced in our party. So I would always I have taken advice from Mitt in the years that I was governor and since. And I'd be happy to take any advice he's willing to give.
I want to ask you about the race, the people you're running against right now. The clear front runner is Donald Trump. We've talked about him quite often. But he said something that I think slots into the whole, like, is he being literal or is he being figurative? Is he just joking around? I want you to take a listen.
But remember, it's a Democrat charging his opponent. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. That means that if I win and somebody wants to run against me, I call my attorney general. I say, listen, indict him. Well, he hasn't done anything wrong that we know of. I don't know. Indict him on income tax evasion. You'll figure it out.
Okay, I've covered a lot of Trump rallies in person. I understand the shtick, and I understand kind of the presentation and the context here. But what's your read on that?
Well, I think it's both, right? So no one can run against him.
You think he might be serious about that?
Oh, of course he is, but not about the context. So no one can run against him again. If he wins,
right,
he's only got one term left, and no one will be able to run against him again. But do I think Donald Trump would try to use the Department of Justice and a compliant attorney general to punish his political enemies? Sure, I do. So I think both things are true. I think he was kidding about the context of what he was talking about in terms of, someone's running against him. He's trying to make a point with what he's alleging Joe Biden is doing. But Donald Trump. Would Donald Trump use a compliant attorney general to go after his political enemies? Of course he would. And we saw that he tried to use the Justice Department to overturn the election and wanted to put Jeffrey Clark in charge of it so that he would. So I don't think, given what his conduct was, forget about what he said in that rally, given what his conduct was in the aftermath of the election, it's absolutely not only plausible, but likely.
One of the most interesting parts of what Romney said to me that hasn't gotten as much attention is when he basically said the Trump indictments and those actions that are alleged are old news, and the American people don't care that much about old news. They care about new news, and he talked about President Biden and Hunter Biden, while also saying, by the way, he doesn't think there's evidence here to even launch this impeachment inquiry. But what do you think of that? Because so much of what you're running on is what Trump is alleged to have done and how he did act.
See, The difference is, I think he's right about the indictments. I think people have processed that and said either they agree or they don't agree with those. To me, what I'm talking about is the conduct that underlies them, because that conduct is a preview of what he would be like if he were the nominee again and the president again. So I do think that's new, according to Mitt's analysis. What he will do next will absolutely be consistent at 78 years old with what he's done before. And let's just contrast, Poppy, where he was in 16 versus where he is now. In 2016, he stood on the convention stage and said, "I am your voice." Today, he says, "I am your retribution." Those are two very different people. And I would argue someone who is now just out for himself purely and not have any element where he's out for the American people. And that's something new and something that people should really be considering when they're deciding who we want our nominee to be. Plus the fact that I just don't believe he can win. And that's a huge problem for the Republican Party.
Are you ever going to get a shot at him directly? I know you've said you're going to follow him around the country if he doesn't show up at the next one or two debates. Why wait? Why aren't you? I know he doesn't travel a ton right now, but pick up his travel schedule and be with him everywhere he goes.
The problem is that he hasn't been anywhere. This is a guy who has made fun of Joe Biden's basement strategy. He's staying in his little house in Bedminster and going nowhere, hiding behind his lawyers and hiding behind his political advisors.
You think that's what it is? His lawyers are saying don't say anything. His political advisors are saying don't go anywhere.
That's right. I absolutely think that's what it is.
Because they're scared?
Of course. Well, because they're scared of him. They're scared of what he'll say and how much deeper he will dig his hole that he's dug it already from a legal perspective. So I think they're concerned about that. Now, he's Donald Trump. And the reason why I do think, to answer your question, I will get a shot at him is because he won't listen to his lawyers, ultimately. He has a very short-term ability to be compliant with anybody's advice. And he'll listen for a little while. One of us will say something on a debate stage or someplace else that he'll want to respond to, and he'll knee-jerk react and respond. So, yeah, I think maybe the third or the fourth debate we'll finally see him, because I also think that voters will start to worry a bit about it in terms of him not showing up and defending his policies. And remember, the state polls are significantly different in some of those early states than the national polls are. And those are the ones that he has to keep an eye on.
Governor, I do want to ask you about some policy issues, and I want to ask you about abortion. We talked about it last time you were on with us, and where you stand now, because it was your position in 2015 that you thought, in your words, a, quote, highly reasonable proposal was, quote, one that brings Americans together. It was called the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, and it would protect unborn children beginning at 20 weeks. That was 2015. People can evolve, but you're now running for president. And after Roe versus Wade was overturned, this is a critical issue for people in both parties. Do you still think a 20-week federal ban on abortion is a, quote, highly reasonable proposal? It
could be, but we're going to have to see. I think now, given that Roe was overturned, I want the states to decide. I've been arguing as a lawyer for years that Roe versus Wade was wrongly decided and that the states should decide. Now we're in the midst of this great democratic experiment. State by state by state, people either through referenda or through their legislatures and their governors are being able to decide what goes on in their states. So to be clear, and then you can follow up, to be clear, I want all of the 50 states to be able to weigh in, if they want to, on what their state laws should be. And then let's see if it's a consensus. Maybe the consensus is at 20, maybe it's at 15, maybe it's at 12. But we have to see it, because look at what's happening. In Oklahoma, for instance, the law is no abortion of any kind except if the life of the mother is threatened. In my state of New Jersey, you can have an abortion up to the 9th month. So let's look at where the consensus is.
But it is the law.
But I'm just talking about the law. And I had this argument with someone the other day, like whether it's rare or not, the legislature and the governor in my state has decided it should be permissible.
So can I follow up with you? Because you said, yes, it could be highly reasonable to have a 20-week ban. At this point, the votes aren't there, as Nikki Haley pointed out on the debate stage, to even get that to a president's desk. But should it come to your desk, hypothetically, as a president? But you laugh. This is so critical for people to know. Excuse me. It's very important for people to know. It sounds like you would sign that legislation.
What I would do is I would sign a bill that represented a consensus of the 50 states. So if there was a consensus of the 50 states, and part of the way you would determine that is, could you get 60 votes in the Senate for it? So if there were a consensus, I absolutely would consider signing that. But the issue is, can you develop a consensus that, one, would be developed by those 50 states, and two, would be adopted by 60 United States senators, which almost certainly,
It's a key.
right, would almost certainly have to be a bipartisan effort. I don't see either party getting to 60 anytime soon. And so that's what it would have to be. And I think using the states as the founders intended, as the laboratory for that, is the right thing to do. Let's let them do
I
it.
appreciate your clarity on that.
Can I just ask, I know we have to go, but the idea of, isn't that kind of a, I understand the legislative process quite well,
Right.
and the consensus process quite well, but doesn't that allow you to not have to take a firm and specific position on, like, we'll just see what the states do because I'm not sure yet
No,
what
it's
I
not
think
that
on
I'm
this?
not sure. I've said before that I'm pro-life and that I believe in exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. And that's the way I governed for 8 years as governor of New Jersey and campaigned that way. That's my personal view of it. But now you're asking me, what would you do as president? And right now, a president can't do anything. And so I'm trying to answer the question you asked. You didn't ask me what my personal feeling is and where that came from. Someday I'll come back. You can ask me about that. And I'm more than happy to answer it because I've been answering it for my entire public life in a very blue state that is very pro-choice. And I had a different opinion. So it wasn't easy to give that answer, but it's the truth. But I think what people need to know is, what will you do as president if you're running for president? I want the 50 states to go forward. I don't want the federal government to jump the gun here. Let's let the 50 states make their decisions. Let's look at what the consensus is. And I'd be open to signing something if it represented consensus.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you,
wish we
guys.
had a lot more
Appreciate
time.
Appreciate
Come
it.
back. Nice
I'm
to
happy
have
to.
you here at the
Thank you
table.
for having me.
Appreciate it.